everyone, welcome to today's video. Today I will be going over all the books that I read in July. July was a great month. I got to participate in Jane Austen July, and if you haven't seen my 3 vlogs, they're all pretty long, but I kind of went crazy with Jane Austen July. I had a lot of fun. I read some great books, and I also did some fun activities that are Jane Austen related. So if you haven't seen any of my vlogs, I will have them linked down below. But today I'll be going over all the books I read in July. I think about 2/3 of them are Jane Austen July related, and then I have a third that I haven't talked about at all throughout the month, so I'm really excited to talk about them as well. Most of the books that I read for Jane Austen July, I talked about more in depth in my vlogs, and so I won't spend too much time talking about them in this video because I already feel like it's going to be long. If you know anything about me, you know that I just meander and I tend to go on tangents. It's really hard for me to summarize books without just going on and on. So I'll do my best. I will try to make this video shorter. So I'm gonna go over all the books that I DNF'd, then I will go over my Jane Austen July reads, and then I'll end off with the books that were not Jane Austen related. So 3 of the books that I DNF'd were for Jane Austen July, but I just ended up not really enjoying them. The first one is The Murder of Mr. Wickham, and I won't talk about why I DNF'd it too much, other than I did not enjoy what the author did with the characters in this book. They are all Jane Austen characters, and I just don't like the direction that the author went with the characters as a whole. So this one just wasn't for me. I then DNF'd Jane and the Unpleasantness at Scargrave Manor, which is a story where Jane Austen is an amateur sleuth, and I had really high hopes for this, but it just didn't do it for me. The writing just wasn't that great, and I was quite bored with it, so I put this one down as well. And for similar reasons, I put down Lizzie and Jane by Catherine Ray. The writing just wasn't for me, and I wasn't interested in the characters, so this one I also decided to DNF. The 4th book that I DNF'd is The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. I started this in June, and I just was bored. I was so bored. And not only that, I was really frustrated with our main character. He is on this journey of revenge, basically. His life was completely ruined, and he was in prison for many years, and then he gets out, and then he goes on this like revenge journey. I enjoyed the book up until and throughout his time in prison, but after that, once he was out, I lost interest, and I wasn't a fan of the story. I was going to power through because it's a classic, and I always feel guilty to put down a classic, but I'm learning more about what I like, and this just isn't it for me. So I'm putting this one down, and I'm so sorry for any Alexandre Dumas fans out there. This wasn't it. All right, on to the books that I read for Jane Austen July. So I'll go through the different prompts for the readathon and then list off what I read for those prompts. So the first prompt was to read one of Jane Austen's main 6 novels, and I fulfilled that with 2 books. The first one being Pride and Prejudice, which was a reread for me. I read it for the first time last year, and I loved it just as much this time. Still a 5-star read. Absolutely love it. So if you don't know what this book is about, we have 2 main characters, and we have a host of side characters that just bring me so much joy. But our 2 main characters, Elizabeth Bennet, she is a very prejudiced person, and Mr. Darcy is a very proud person. They butt heads. It's a huge enemies to lovers trope in this book, and it's just a whole lot of fun. I absolutely love this book. And yeah, that's all I'm gonna say. Otherwise, I will go on and on and on. So you should definitely check it out because it's great. The next book I read is Emma, and this is my first time reading it, and I loved it so much. 5 stars. Again, I talked a lot about it in my vlogs, so I won't spend too much time talking about it, but I loved this book. Emma Woodhouse is one of the most irritating characters I've ever come across in a book, but her antics just make this book so enjoyable. My favorite part is Mr. Knightley, who is Emma's brother-in-law's brother. He is basically the only person who really stands up to Emma and her matchmaking schemes and all of that, and it's just so fun. And Mr. Knightley is one of the best male characters ever. I adore him. This book was great. 5 stars. I also buddy read this with Chrissy from Chrissy's Purple Library, and we had such a good time buddy reading this book. It just made it so much more fun. But yeah, loved it. The next prompt was to read something by Jane Austen that is not one of her main 6 novels. So for that, I read The Beautiful Cassandra, which is a very short collection of some of Jane Austen's juvenilia, and I gave this 3 stars, I think. I overall enjoyed it. Most of the stories in here were a little odd, and I didn't get it, but they are her juvenilia, and she wrote these as a, younger child, and I think they're fun. I just don't think they're anything very special. But yeah, overall this was pretty cute. I also read Lady Susan for this prompt, and it is a epistolary novella, and I loved it. 5 stars. This is one of my favorite of all of Jane Austen's works that I have read. Oh my gosh. This is another one of those books where the main character is awful. She is terrible. She's not a good person. There's nothing endearing about her, but watching her antics is somehow entertaining. And yeah, this was just a whole lot of fun. We have a woman in her late 30s who is such a flirt and a homewrecker, and she's just a terrible person. She's a terrible person, a terrible mom. She was recently widowed and thinks it's a good idea to continue flirting with men, even married a man, and she's just terrible. But this was very fun to read, so I gave that one 5 stars as well. Prompt number 3 was to read a nonfiction work about Jane Austen or her time. So I read Jane Austen's England by Roy and Leslie Adkins, and I think I gave this 2.5 stars, 2.75. It didn't keep me gripped and as interested in the content as I hoped it would have. There were a couple parts that were definitely interesting, and they had more to do with very specific topics that I'm interested in, but I just found the writing style to be very dry and not engaging. But this book is very, very comprehensive. It deals with so many topics like raising children, money system, religion, the Church of England, marriage, how gowns were made, where people went to the bathroom, medicine, the judicial system, like so many different topics, but it just failed to keep me interested as I was reading it. So 2.5 to 2.75 stars. It's not absolutely terrible. I feel like this is a good book to read if you are very interested in the Georgian era, but yeah, just wasn't my favorite. I forgot to mention a third book that I actually read for the second prompt, which was to read something by Jane Austen that's not one of her 6 main novels. And so I read Jane Austen's letters, and I think it's the completed collection of letters that we currently have. And I don't think I rated this one. I think I just left this one unrated because it just felt weird to give it a numerical rating. But I really, really enjoyed it. It felt very, very personal. There were obviously letters that I just wasn't as interested in, but a lot of the letters had to do with Jane Austen's friends and, you know, balls that were happening and dress shops she would go to. She wrote a lot to her sister Cassandra, and that was really, really sweet to see. They definitely had a special sisterhood, and we learned about deaths in her area, marriages, births, so many things. And in the later letters, as Jane Austen is older and she's begun to write her main novels, we get to see her write letters to her sister and also some of her brothers and some of the people working in the publishing industry about her books. And that was just really, really interesting as well. But overall, I enjoyed it. And I think if you are really interested in Jane Austen, this is something you might enjoy. Prompt number 4 was to read a retelling of a Jane Austen book or a work of historical fiction set in her time. So I read one retelling / sequel sort of to one of her books, and then I read 2 books set in the Georgian era. But the book that is kind of a sequel to one of Jane Austen's works is The Clergyman's Wife, and this book kind of continues the story of Charlotte Lucas, who married Mr. Collins in Pride and Prejudice. And Charlotte Lucas was Lizzie's lifelong friend, and she ends up marrying Mr. Collins, and throughout the book you're kind of learning potential motives that she may have had, because you may think, who would marry Mr. Collins? He's a very odd person, makes a lot of people uncomfortable. And so this book deals a lot with Charlotte's inner thoughts and turmoil, and she's a young mother in this book as well, and it's very melancholic, but I did overall enjoy it. There were a couple things that made me uncomfortable. There were a couple sexual scenes that I could have done without, but overall, I enjoyed it, and I think I gave it 3.5 stars, but that was one of the books I read for this prompt. Another book I read is A Castaway in Cornwall by Julie Klassen. This is also set in the Regency era, and in this book, we have a girl who likes to roam the coasts of Cornwall looking for items from shipwrecks, basically, and if there are any identifiers on them, she likes to send them back to family members as a way to comfort them if they've had loved ones lost at sea. So she's very altruistic in this regard. And then a man washes up on shore. He is a shipwreck survivor, and he has his own issues that he's dealing with, and it's basically about the both of them kind of facing their own battles, their own insecurities and struggles, and coming together and working together. And it's a really sweet book. I think I gave this also 3.5 stars. I found it a little slow in terms of its pacing, but overall I did enjoy it. And the third book that I read for this prompt is Ross Poldark by Winston Graham, an amazing, amazing, amazing book set in the Georgian era. So I watched the show for the first time a couple years ago, fell in love, absolutely obsessed, and then I found out there are books, and I had no idea the show was based on books. But needless to say, this just made me love the show even more. I obviously adore this book. I gave it 5 stars. And it is about a man named Ross who was fighting in America during the War of Independence, if I'm not mistaken. And he comes back to England, Cornwall area, and he basically has nothing going for him. The woman that he loved is engaged to his cousin. Ross's father has just died, and his farm is a complete disaster. And he's trying to start up a mine, and there's just so much going on in this book. We have different classes of society. We have upper class Cornish society, and then we have the minor families who are struggling financially, and it's just, this book is so good. It's so, so good. I absolutely loved it. It is slower paced, but it's the kind of slow paced book that I love so much because I feel like I'm living alongside the characters, and that's exactly what I want in a slower paced book. So highly recommend this one if you love Georgian era fiction, if you love slower paced books that are amazingly character driven. Highly, highly recommend. I also have a book to talk about that I'm not sure which prompt it would fall under. I guess it could fall under the prompt that I mentioned before. I'm so sorry, I'm really disorganized in this video. But the previous prompt, which was a nonfiction work about Jane Austen or her time, I could fit in Dinner with Mr. Darcy, which is a cookbook, but it is a little more than a cookbook because there are pages that have information about meal times and just anything from what pantries were like, how they set up dining tables in the Regency era, and I did make a couple recipes from it. One of them was in a vlog, and so I really enjoyed it. I feel weird rating a cookbook, but it's 5 out of 5 in my eyes. Loved this cookbook. Prompt number 5 was to read a book by a contemporary of Jane Austen, so published between 1775 and 1817. So I read a book published smack in the middle of that. I read The Mysteries of Udolpho by Anne Radcliffe. This was published in the 1790s. And this one was a very, very interesting reading experience. I gave it 2.5 stars, but since finishing it, and even throughout, I was kind of going between, this feels like a 3.5 star at times, to I can't stand this book, I want to give it 1 star, back up to I'm really enjoying it. And it's probably because of how long it is and the fact that it's very, very up and down in terms of pacing. It's not consistent and it's mostly slow, but then it'll just kind of have something big happen and then it's slow again. And it's very, very weird book. But this is one of those quintessential early Gothic romances that kind of set the course for a lot of other Gothic romances that came after it. And it's set partly in France and then partly in Italy at this castle called Udolpho. And you have our protagonist who recently lost her parents, and so she's living with her aunt who married a very, very sinister man, and it just kind of goes from there. There are many Gothic elements, and it's overall pretty fun. It's just a lot of traveling, a lot of nature descriptions, which I love nature descriptions. It's one of the reasons I love authors like Ellen Montgomery. But in this book, it was just way too much, like way too much. But 2.5 stars, it's like smack in the middle of the road for me. It's not absolutely terrible, but I didn't love it either. So yeah, this was a very interesting reading experience, but overall pretty decent. So prompts number 6 and 7 have to do with movies / like adaptations. So prompt 6 is to watch a direct screen adaptation of a Jane Austen book. So I watched Pride and Prejudice from 1995. I still have to watch the 2005 one, but I don't know why. It's Keira Knightley. I don't like Keira Knightley. That's the only reason I haven't watched it yet. But I promise you guys I will watch it. I just need to get over my dislike of Keira Knightley. And then I also watched Emma from 2009, which is a miniseries, and I love it so much. It's incredible. And then prompt number 7 was to watch a modern screen adaptation or retelling of a Jane Austen book, which I haven't done. I'm generally not a movie or TV show person, with the exception of like period dramas and things like that. But yeah, I'm kind of not really interested in any of the ones out there, so I skipped that prompt. But that is it for Jane Austen July, and now I'll talk about all the books that I read that have nothing to do with this readathon. These are also in no particular order, so I'm going to be starting off with an Agatha Christie that I was pretty disappointed with, actually. It wasn't terrible, like I gave it 2.75 stars, but the mystery fell really flat, and the male characters, for some reason, I just couldn't make out who was who. Like, I would always get them confused, and it was just a very weird experience. But I read They Do It With Mirrors. This is a Miss Marple book, and yeah, it wasn't great in my opinion. So if you like going into your Agatha Christie's blind, then I would suggest skipping ahead because I will read the back. Honestly, it was so forgetful that I need to read the back for you. So it says, Miss Marple senses danger when she visits a friend living in Stony Gates, a rehab center. Her fears are confirmed when someone shoots at the administrator, and although he's not injured, a mysterious visitor is less fortunate, shot dead simultaneously in another part of the building. Pure coincidence? Miss Marple thinks not, and must use all her cunning to solve the riddle of the stranger's visit and his murder. So, I guessed who the killer was, and I even guessed why they did it. It wasn't great. It wasn't great. And there is a trigger warning for schizophrenia in this book, so if that's a trigger for you, yeah, stay away, because I'm not a fan of how Agatha Christie dealt with that. Yeah, pretty disappointed. Then I read Dreams of Savannah by Rosanna M. White. This was for my Christian book club, and I think I gave this 3.75 stars right when I finished it, but then I brought my rating down to a 3 just because of how forgetful this book is. In all honesty, if it weren't for the male characters in this book, I probably would have DNF'd it because I did not like the main female protagonist. She just seemed very immature and kind of out of touch with reality some of the time. Not all of the time, but just, I don't know. I didn't like her at all. So this book is set during the Civil War, and we have a girl named Cordelia who is a really big storyteller. She loves to kind of like put stories together to share with her family and friends, and it's something that she just loves to do. It brings people a lot of peace. It brings her peace. And when the man that she loves, Finn, is shipwrecked and thought to be dead, she continues using stories to kind of help his family cope and help her cope as well. But Finn actually survives, and this storyline is my favorite part of the book, actually. He survives, and he ends up being saved by a free black man, so he was never a slave. He grew up in England. He's very, very educated and very, very intelligent, and that really throws Finn off because Finn is fighting on the Confederate side during the Civil War. And so this man, Luther, he is my absolute favorite character in this book. His faith is so inspiring and so realistic, and I love how he really, really struggled to even want to care for Finn as he's in danger of dying from his injuries because of the shipwreck. Luther is angry, and Finn actually washes up on shore in Cuba where Luther is living at the time. And so Luther is like, why? Why this man? Why a Confederate soldier? The people that want slavery to, continue. And he really has to fight with, his own bitterness, and that was just a really, really interesting part of the story. But yeah, the story is basically about Finn learning that it's not enough to just have a good heart and treat your slaves well. And he's learning that, slavery as an institution is completely morally wrong. And it's just a really, really beautiful story. But yeah, Cordelia's plot line, Cordelia's character arc just didn't interest me as much. But overall, it's a pretty decent book. So yeah, 3 stars, not too bad. In my video where I talked about my favorite books of the year so far, I mentioned Spy Family being one of them. And oh my goodness, that still stands. Spy Family Volume 1 was incredible. It completely blew me away and surpassed my expectations. I didn't expect too much out of it just because it's been so hyped up, and I'm not even really drawn to manga in general, so I picked it up on a whim and loved it. 5 stars. So I kind of struggle explaining it, but we have a few characters. We have a spy who we don't even know what his real name is in the first volume. He goes on all these missions, and then one of his missions involves this school, and he has to adopt a daughter to send to this school so that he can somehow spy on a student at the school to get to her father. It's this whole chain that he has to set up. And so he needs to adopt a daughter, and he doesn't realize that the daughter he adopted is a telepath. She can read his mind. She knows exactly what he is, what he does, what he's thinking at all times, but he doesn't know this. And then he also has to find a wife to make them look like a completed family. And so he ends up with this woman who is an assassin, but he doesn't know she's an assassin. She doesn't know he's a spy. And then this little girl, Anya, is like, ooh, an assassin for a mom and a spy for a dad. What on earth is this? And she's this little girl. She's adorable. Anya is just the cutest thing ever. And I just had such a blast with this book, and I can't wait to continue the series because I think it's just amazing. I loved it. I would definitely recommend if you like manga. Even if you don't like manga, try it out because I think it lives up to the hype. All right, then my second favorite book of the month is Love and a Little White Lie by Tammy L. Gray. I gave a contemporary romance, a Christian contemporary romance, 5 stars. Who am I? This is not normal for me. I do not like contemporary romances, even if they're Christian. I don't like contemporary romances that much. For some reason, romance is set in the past. I love. I don't know what it is about the modern day. I don't know what it is. Anyways, enough of me blabbering. This book was so good. It was so good. 5 I loved it. I loved it so much. Thank you so much to Oshina and Amanda, and I think a couple other of my friends who hyped up this book. You encouraged me to read it, and I loved it. So in this book, we have a character named January who she is basically just tired of life. She has had some issues in the romance and dating department, and she's not too happy. She also didn't have the best childhood. She grew up with a pretty distant mom and a bunch of stepdads who just weren't in the picture. And then she ends up living with her aunt and uncle who are very strong Christians. But Jan is basically like maybe an atheist, more like an agnostic. She just wants nothing to do with Christianity. She doesn't really believe in anything. But she ends up living with her aunt and finds a job at this church. And I forget exactly what the job was, but she had to do like administrative stuff. So honestly, I didn't pay too much attention as to exactly what her job was because I was just so invested in other parts of the story. But she ends up at this church and she has to hide the fact that she's not a Christian. And she gets the job, she starts working and meets a lot of people and, you know, hears more about Jesus and everything. And it's just a very interesting story. She meets a couple men. One of them is very much in the background and he was my favorite character. If you know, you know. Dylan. Okay, moving on. And she also meets a man named Cameron who is really struggling. He is a musician. He sings on the worship team and he seems to be struggling big time, not only with his music and writing music, but just with his identity and what he's meant to do in life. And so they have very different struggles, but they kind of connect and the story goes from there. And I'm not going to say anything else because I feel like it'll be a spoiler. But yes, 5 stars, loved it. Please read it. Even if contemporary is not your genre, it's definitely not my genre. And I still think it's a great read. So loved it. And then my favorite book of the month. It was so good. The Librarian of Boone's Hollow by Kim Vogel Sawyer. The only other book I've ever read by this author got 1 star from me. I did not like it at all. And so going into this book, I went with very, very low expectations, but at the same time, I was hopeful because Lindsay and Amanda both loved it. So I started it and I was like, okay, this is pretty good. And then I kept reading. And then once I got to a certain part of the book where it really, really picked up, I just couldn't put it down. And I think I finished it within a couple hours. I just listened to the audiobook while reading along physically, and it was amazing. It was so good. So this book is set during the Great Depression in Kentucky on the outskirts of Appalachia. This book is set in a very, very small community, and we have our protagonist named Addie who her family has been greatly affected by the Great Depression and she can't go to school anymore. Her parents can't afford to send her to the school she was at. And so she takes on this job opportunity in Boone's Hollow as a traveling librarian. And this kind of traveling librarian initiative was set up, I think, by the Roosevelts to help bring books out to isolated communities and things like that. So Addie, our protagonist, starts this job as she meets so many interesting characters, one of them being Bettina, who is basically the antagonist of the book. She's very, very unlikable, but as you learn more about her, you realize why she is the way she is, and you kind of grow to have more compassion for her. And I think the second book in this duology is about Bettina, so I'm really excited to read it. But going back to Addie, she starts this job. She is like a city girl living in Boone's Hollow, and it's quite the culture shock, you could say, for her. She ends up living with an elderly woman named Nanny Faye, and I love this woman. I loved her so much. She just made this story. But the people of Boone's Hollow are very prejudiced against Nanny Faye because I'm pretty sure she's part Cherokee, and they don't like her. They think she's a witch, and in fact, she's actually a very strong Christian, and it's such an interesting part of this book. And we have another character named Emmett, and he grew up in Boone's Hollow, but ended up going to college, which was a big deal at the time. And so when he comes back to visit, people don't really see him in a positive light. They think now he's a city boy, you know, he doesn't really belong back in Boone's Hollow with the mining community. And yeah, I can't even coherently talk about this book. I feel like I've been all over the place with my description of it, but it's just so good. It's so good. And what I absolutely loved about it, and something I really appreciate, is that the romance is very, very, very much a subplot. There is absolutely nothing cheesy about it. It is completely natural. Like, it's a natural progression, but it's also beautiful. And I love this book so much. I loved it so, so much. I would highly, highly recommend if you love anything Appalachia related historical fiction. It reminded me of Christie, which is a show that I grew up watching based on the book by Catherine Marshall. And I just ordered that book because I need more Appalachia in my life. So I can't get enough of this book, and I cannot wait to read the second one. I said I wanted this video to be short. Not gonna happen. But anyways, that is it for my July wrap up. I had a lot of fun with Jane Austen July, and I read some other great books. And I am so thankful that you guys stuck around. If you have stuck around to the end of the video, thank you so much. And thank you so much for everyone who has subscribed recently. I hit 500 subscribers, and I'm just so grateful for each and every one of you guys. And yep, that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you all in my next one. Bye!